Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on democracy, rule of law, and authoritarian populism, a postcard from Europe. I'm Cristina Fasone from Guido Carli, and this seminar is the occasion to discuss and present two important books that have been recently published. One co-authored by Matej Avbelj and Jernej, Letnar, Černič, on the impact of European institutions and the rule of law, on the rule of law and democracy, Slovenia and beyond. The second one, this is published by Art in the book series on EU law in the member states. And the second book is an edited collection on Italian populism and constitutional law, strategies, conflicts, and dilemmas, to which I've also had the pleasure to contribute. And this is edited by Giacomo Delledonne, Giuseppe Martinico, Matteo Monti, and Fabio Pacini, published in the framework of the Palgrave book series on challenges to democracy in the 21st century. This webinar is co-organized by STALS, EURACTIV Italy, CesUE, a new university in Slovenia, and Diritti Comparati. And this event is part of the Jean Monnet project We EU, Noi Europei. And there is also participation of the Slovenian Research Agency, which has supported the publication of the book by Matej and Jernej. You can follow and share this event on the Facebook page of Diritti Comparati. And without further ado, we will enter immediately into the discussion. Just let me say that it's very important in my view that we are discussing this book together. They are to some extent complementing each other. One focused on a founding member state of the European Union, another one on a country of more recent accession, neighboring states. And their perspective is slightly different because one is focused on populism, but there is in the book, I think, an important reflection also on how populism can lead to rule of law problems and democratic backsliding. The European Union lies in the background of the book, while the book by Matej and Jernej is more focused on the impact of the European Union on rule of law and democratic backsliding, potentially. I must say that while I'm more familiar with the Italian system, I've really learned a lot on the Slovenian constitutional system and the challenges that is facing thanks to Matej and Jerniej's book. But also to some extent, the populism in this case is in the background on this book. So I think that discussing them together is very fruitful. So looking forward to it, and I will immediately introduce our first speaker, Matej Avbelj, who is professor of European law at New University Slovenia, for its presentation. So Matej, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for this very nice presentation. Thank you very much for moderating this event. I'm really happy to be participating in it with all the colleagues and friends. We have all had a very fruitful history of collaboration in the past. And now in this slightly unusual times, I'm also happy that we are joining our forces online in this webinar. As you pointed out, Cristina, we have indeed recently published this book, which is examining the impact of the European institutions, that is the institutions both of the European Union and of the Council of Europe, on the state of the rule of law and democracy, first of all and foremost in our book in Slovenia, but also beyond, contextualizing the Slovenian case study in a broader context of what we have known as or what has been known as constitutional or democratic backsliding. It is it's quite a big book, and since I have only a few minutes to introduce it, I decided to pick just a few elements out of it. Let me first of all start with the grand idea against which this book is actually built. Our book starts with a benchmark idea of constitutional democracy. So whatever else is going on in Slovenia and other states that we are examining in the book, we are measuring the actual practices against the standards, the ideals of constitutional democracy. And I think it is important also for today's debate to define what we actually mean by constitutional democracy. And here we draw on a Habermasian definition. Habermas has defined constitutional democracy as a paradoxical union of contradictory principles. Of democracy on the one hand side that deals with sovereignty, the people, the majority, and on the other side, the rule of law that is interested in the protection of individuals, procedural safeguards, also the protection of minorities. So the entire book is written against this ideal, and as we have been writing, we insisted that constitutional democracy requires robust institutions, it requires checks and balances, it requires a political space which is pluralist, it requires a media space which is also pluralist, and it requires economic spectrum, an economic system which is diverse, with dispersed private ownership. And all in all, I think this also requires the existence of vibrant and diverse civil society. So this is a kind of benchmark against which we have been measuring Slovenia, and I think we are all measuring other member states in the European Union. And the more this discrepancy between the actual practices out there and the ideal is broadening, the bigger there is this discrepancy, the bigger there is a gap between the ideal and practice, the more we can speak about constitutional backsliding, or as I would also use the term, decay of constitutional democracy. So this would be my first point, to make clear what we actually mean by constitutional democracy that we use as a benchmark for writing this book. Second important point that I would like to advance today about this book is that we are arguing that the aforementioned democratic decay can happen in two different manners. Democratic constitution, a decay of constitutional democracy can happen in an overt manner, or it can happen in a covert manner. And I think so far in the European Union, when we have been speaking about constitutional backsliding, democratic backsliding, decay of constitutional democracy, we have been focusing most on the overt manner of constitutional backsliding. An overt manner happens and requires a complete institutional overhaul. It requires sometimes changing of the constitution. It requires hijacking of the institutions. It requires putting your own loyalists into every possible and imaginable position in the state. It requires capturing of the economy as well as the civil society. And when this is done all this has to be done, is usually done in an overt manner. And when it's done in this overt manner, this also calls for a justification, for a narrative that legitimizes this practice. And the narrative that has been legitimizing this practice in the actual cases of overt constitutional backsliding in the European Union has been the narrative of populism, as scholars and other observers have described it. So I think the most outspoken examples of overt constitutional backsliding are nowadays Hungary and Poland. And we have heard a lot about these two countries. However, people have heard much less about covert manner of constitutional backsliding, and we are arguing in this book of ours that Slovenia is such a case. So now, what is now, in conceptual terms, a covert manner of constitutional backsliding? A covert manner of constitutional backsliding, it is characteristic of it that it takes place over a longer span of time. It takes place incrementally over decades. And for that reason, since it's taking place for over such a long period of time, it carries with it, it establishes the aura of normality. And when these covert practices are taking place in such a manner, there is no need to change the institutions fundamentally. There is no need for a complete institutional overhaul overnight. There is no need to place your own loyalists in all the institutions of the state, of the civil society, to capture the economy overnight, because this is taking place in a longer period of time in a covert manner, also using much less brutal means. It can be done in a softer manner. It requires no grand narrative. It doesn't require investing into a populist narrative. All it requires is that the system produces just enough output legitimacy that everyone is somehow satisfied in this process. And this process is then also very nicely fed by all sorts of kleptocratic practices, where those in power who have covertly subdued the institutions in the state have been able to divide impera between the producers of such product. So in this, the argument of this book, inter alia, is that while there are many phases of constitutional backsliding in contemporary Europe, especially in post-communist member states, and then we have to distinguish between the overt and covert manners of constitutional backsliding, of decaying, of capturing the state. And while those covert practices are much more visible, overt practices are much more visible, much more transparent, they might be also much more aggressive, it is not necessary that they're actually also more harmful in practice. Because in terms of covert practices, and I'll be done in a second, they're much less visible, they have been taking place over a longer period of time. It's much more difficult to make them transparent, to tell a story about them, and so it's also much more difficult to draw critical attention to these kind of cases. And if it's more difficult to draw attention to this kind of critical attention to these kind of cases, it might be also more difficult to repair a constitutional democracy that has been captured in a covert manner than the one that has been captured in an overt manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matej, also for being very precise on the time and for clarifying, for these conceptual clarifications, which are very important, and in particular, this covert manner of reaching constitutional decay, which is apparently not maybe equally harmful as for the overt manner in which constitutional democracy can suddenly disappear. Now is the time for Giacomo Delledonne to step in. He's a postdoctoral fellow in comparative public law at Sant'Anna in Pisa, and he will talk about the other book. Thanks, Giacomo.
Thank you, Cristina. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank all those in charge of the projects and organizations that have made this event possible. In my intervention, I would like to stress some points regarding the concept underlying this book, Italian Populism and Constitutional Law. It's a book on Italy that aims to address an international readership. So the point is, in what respect does the Italian case deserve attention for comparative purposes? In this respect, again, I notice some similarities with the approach followed by Matej, Avbelj, and Jernej, Letnar, Černič in their book. As Cristina has said, there is some complementarity between our two books. So Italy, we have considered Italy as a prime example of post-World War II constitutionalism, thereby meaning a kind of constitutionalism marked by a will to break with an authoritarian past, a kind of constitutionalism in which value-laden contents are crucial in defining the characteristics, the inspiration of a constitutional order. So Italy is an example of post-World War II constitutionalism, and it also has some distinctive characters of its own that makes a reflection on our country quite important, quite fruitful. First of all, a peculiar understanding of democracy. In the constitutional order of the Italian Republic, representative democracy coexists with some elements of direct democracy, and as I will say later, and Giuseppe will also say probably, this is quite important for a proper understanding of our constitutional order. Second point, Italy is a founding member of the European Union, and the membership of the European Union looms large in the chapters of this book. In order to understand the implications and the stakes underlying the populist challenge to constitutional democracy, it's crucial to consider, to have in mind that Italy has been for more than 60 years, a member of the European communities and later of the European Union, and this contributes to shaping its constitutional order. And in order to understand the impact of the populist challenge on its own constitutional order, the European dimension is, of course, a crucial one. Third point, Italy is a country with a long tradition of populist and populist-like politics. There is a long-standing, well-established anti-parliamentarian tradition. In the founding years of the Republic, some populist movements actively engaged in challenging the apparent monopoly of the mass parties. A famous example is the Uomo Qualunque, the Everyman Front. And most of all, over the course of the political transition that has followed the end of the Cold War since 1989, 1990, many aspects of Bernard Manent's audience democracy that are shared by almost all contemporary constitutional democracies in the West have characterized the Italian political scene to the highest degree, with the emergence of a wide set of self-styled or non-self-styled populist movement, the apparently unstoppable success of populist arguments in the public debate, in the public arena, and this was perhaps the highest point so far in this path, the launch of an entirely self-styled populist government in spring 2018, the so-called yellow-green government made up of a coalition between the League and the Five Star Movement. So Italy is a typical constitutional democracy in Western Europe, but it also has some distinctive traits that made it a very promising topic, but also for successes or for other comparative analysis. And so it's a book on Italy, and it's a book in which we have talked about the impact of populism from the relatively unusual perspective of constitutional law. Of course, in this field of research, a primary role in shaping concepts, in promoting, in defining research lines has been played by political scientists and political theorists and political sociologists, Yves Megny, Yves Surel, Nadia Urbinati. And it should come as no surprise that Paul Blokker has written the first chapter of this book. We have focused on the way the populist discourse shapes or impacts upon the toolkit of constitutional law, and in so doing, we have addressed some seminal questions concerning the relationship between constitutionalism and populism. And in order to grasp the overall impact of populist actors and claims on the Italian constitutional order, we have developed an all-around comprehensive analysis. We have focused both on classical concepts of constitutional law, constitutional amendment, lawmaking procedures, non-legislative parliamentary procedures, referendums, and on policy debates, including the most topical ones. So the book has a structure in which there are some strong methodological commitments on which Giuseppe will make some points later. And starting from these methodological commitments, it develops an overarching, a comprehensive analysis of the impact of populist actors on the Italian legal order. In so doing, we have relied not only on constitutional law scholarship, but on other strands of public law scholarship because of the multifaceted dimensions that the populist challenge reveals. So criminal law, law and religion, new technologies, and so on. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giacomo, for your clear presentation, for guiding us through this book. And I pass the floor now to Jernej Letnar Černič, who is Associate Professor of Human Rights and Constitutional Law at New University in Slovenia. So Jernej, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Cristina, dear friends, dear colleagues. It's an honor to be in this panel. However, I have to admit that I would rather see you in person and also rather go for a dinner after the webinar, but nonetheless, I hope we can do this maybe in the autumn of this year. Well, my presentation or my input into this discussion will be also on the book which we just published together with Matej, Avbelj, and Cristina on the impact of European institutions on the rule of law and democracy in Central Europe, but more specifically on Slovenia. And this book grew from personal experience. Well, we both were born in Slovenia, and I spent most of my childhood in the communist Yugoslavia and communist Slovenia, no? And only later Slovenia became independent, and in 1990 it held first democratic elections, and then it got independent in June 1991. And at that time, of course, we were too young to follow closely constitutional developments. But later, when I started law school in the second half of the 90s, we were observing how the first mandate of the Slovenian Constitutional Court introduced the normative standards of constitutional democracy, rule of law, human rights protection, human dignity, in pluralism into Slovenian society. And here I have to emphasize that these concepts were very foreign to the Slovenian environment, and in a way they still are. And the book tells the story about the failure of translation of normative standards of rule of law and constitutional democracy into practice. One has to know that Slovenia emerged as an independent democratic state from a particular authoritarian, I prefer to use the adjective totalitarian regime, one-party political system which violated human rights, where judges received phone calls from politicians how to decide particular cases. There was no separation of powers in the government. So it was a totalitarian state. So of course, as any other state in Central and Eastern Europe who was coming out of Iron Curtain to constitutional democracy, Slovenia faced many challenges how to internalize the standards of human dignity, pluralism, rule of law. And this book accounts for these hurdles in the translation of these standards in different fields of Slovenian society, different fields of Slovenian constitutional democracy. The book itself is an example for legal research. Nonetheless, we try to also apply some methods from a sociology of law. And our colleague Cristina also wrote a chapter on the economy of Slovenia, transition from a state plan to the market economy. But nonetheless, it's in major part is an example of normative research. And I thought that would be maybe useful to give you 3 examples to see how those normative standards were poorly translated into practice of Slovenian institutions, into practice of Slovenian judiciary, legislative branch, and executive branch. And those of you who will read this book, you will see that we are very, very critical about the reality of Slovenian constitutional democracy. Now, we use in the book a lot of language in the phrases such as dirty togetherness, corruption, presence of nepotism, substitution of rule of law by rule by law. Those practices which are so often seen across Central and Eastern Europe. And we thought that this book will fill the gap in the research which has been published in the last 10 to 20 years on comparative constitutional law. As already Matej said, most of the authors concentrate on the recent examples of very direct attempts to overthrow constitutional democracy in Hungary and Poland. But most of the Central and Eastern European countries are example of overt attacks, clandestine, secret attempts to overthrow constitutional democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, or even to use a harsher term, to capture the state within constitutional democracy. And the book tells the story of Slovenia. There are many other examples from Romania, Bulgaria to the former republics of the Soviet Union. But let me now give you 3 examples to see how these normative standards were not translated in practice in daily life of Slovenian constitutional democracy. Well, the first example would be the issue of human rights protection. Slovenia, after 1991, adopted very modern formal normative standards of human rights protection. It is a state party almost to every UN human rights treaty. It is party to the European Human Rights Convention since 1994. So the formal standards are very, very strong and solid. But nonetheless, the human rights situation in Slovenia is often judged by ideology. So, for example, state institutions such as Office of Ombudsman or any other government agency would only focus on certain issues of human rights protection. So, for example, rights of Roma, rights of so-called erased persons from the former republics of Yugoslavia, rights of migrants, asylum seekers. But then, in the same breath, they turn a blind eye to also very important issues of human rights protection, such as protections of civil and political rights. No, most importantly, right to fair trial before the Slovenian courts, and also right to life. You may know that after the Second World War in Slovenia, several tens of thousands of people were summarily executed, and no one was held responsible for that. Not only that, no one was prosecuted, and also the state is very reluctant even to dig out the graves and put the name of the victims on the graves where they were summarily executed. So very piecemeal, partial approach, which is very much connected to the ideology of a person, political party in power at the moment in Slovenia. Then second example would be the media landscape. Slovenia is very textbook example of post-communist state where companies and individuals, let's call them tycoons, from other industry sectors such as construction or agriculture, they invested heavily into media. They bought newspapers, televisions, tabloids, in order to influence the making of media reality in Slovenia. And this way, they also distorted the Slovenian constitutional democracy. Of course, the large part of Slovenian media landscape is also controlled by the public sector, the public TV, which is unfortunately still under the influence of the daily politics, which has a direct influence on the election of the director of the Slovenian television and radio. And often the Slovenian public TV receives complaints as being partial, as representing only one part of society. And just briefly, the third example would be as to the influence of the European Court of Human Rights in Slovenia. Well, here the influence was also only piecemeal. The exact normative influence was only felt in the so-called pilot judgments. So all in all, to conclude, our book aims to contribute to the debate on the constitutional backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe, but it takes a different turn from a prevailing literature, arguing that constitutional backsliding is also occurring in a more clandestine, overt way. Thank you, Cristina. Sorry for being a bit over the time.
No, not at all. And thanks, Jernej, for providing us with these insights and examples, concrete example of these clandestine or covert constitutional backsliding. Now I pass the floor to Giuseppe Martinico, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Public Law at Sant'Anna. Giuseppe, you have the floor.
Thanks indeed, Cristina. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. I'm gonna spend my minutes to say 2 or 3 things about our book in order to emphasize its comparative flavor, building upon what Giacomo already said. Of course, this is a book about the Italian case, but we try to avoid we would say a mere parochial level of analysis. Indeed, we treated Italy as a case study, as an example of post-authoritarian constitutionalism. Our premise is that constitutionalism is counter-majoritarian in nature, and in this sense, this aspect has been enriched by a series of techniques, doctrines, devices added after the Second World War. I'm referring to the expansion of the judicial review of the legislation, the emergence of eternity clauses, and of course the necessity of supermajority to pass constitutional amendments. We do have all this stuff in now our constitution, so Italy is a perfect lab to explore the tricky relationship between constitutionalism and populism. What do they share? Well, both constitutionalism and populism are based on a profound, I would say, distrust towards political power, what Danilo Zolo called potestative pessimism. And both populism and constitutionalism use similar concepts. However, this is our premise. Further analogies cannot be found. I mean, in the sense that we try to make a distinction between these two phenomena, and we are interested in studying how populists, especially when they are in office, borrow, use, and manipulate categories of constitutional theory and instruments of constitutional law. In so doing, populists advance, that's our point, the sort of constitutional counter-narrative. And in order to explore this counter-narrative, we try to study how populists approach constitutions. And in the introduction, we identified two strategies. Mimetism and parasitism. Parasitism is a concept which has already been studied in studies on populism. I'm referring to Arditi, Urbinati, Fournier, among lawyers. By that, we refer to the attempt made by populists at altering, at changing, even in a radical manner, the, we'll say, axiological premises of a constitutional democracy. How? First of all, by reducing democracy to the mere rule of majority, and presenting the democracy as a sort of trump card which should prevail always over the other pillars of the constitutional constellation, the rule of law and the protection of minorities. But what about mimetism? Mimetism here refers to the way in which populist leaders try to present themselves as and their claims as a compatible and consistent with the language of constitutionalism. And in order to explain this point, I'm gonna quote a short passage taken from an official speech given by Giuseppe Conte at the United Nations in 2018. That speech occurred during the first Conte government. We do believe that there is a strong continuity between the first and the second Conte governments, and I'm happy to I mean, say something more on this in the debate if you're interested in that. I'm quoting Giuseppe Conte. He said, "When some accuse us of sovereignism or populism, I always enjoy pointing out that Article 1 of the Italian Constitution cites sovereignty and the people." Right. Here, one can see the attempt made by populists at finding a reading consistent with the text of the Italian Constitution by stretching at the same time some of its key concepts, and most importantly, by exercising a sort of cherry-picking approach to the wording of the Constitution. Indeed, when referring to Article 1 of the Italian Constitution, populists tend to mention just a part of the relevant norm, the part recognizing the principle of popular sovereignty in order to find a confirmation of their majoritarian approach to the fundamental charter, and in order to reinforce the false dichotomy between themselves, the people voted by the people, and the others seen as the enemy of the people. In so doing, they tactically omit that the same Article 1 of the Italian Constitution immediately clarifies how popular sovereignty should be understood as limited by the Constitution itself. In fact, this is the actual wording of Article 1 of our Constitution. Sovereignty belongs to the people and is exercised by the people in the forms and within the limits of the Constitution. This way of proceeding is very telling of how populists approach the Constitution. This is very telling of their majoritarian approach. Populists understand the constitutions as straitjackets, and this is one of the points in common between populism and popular and political constitutionalism. Again, in my view, however, these analogies cannot be extended further. And another important element is given by the fact that they perceive the constitutions as sources of unreasonable constraints imposed on the exercise of popular sovereignty. In this way, populists tend to come up with their artificial tension existing, according to them, between constitutionalism and democracy. That's why, according to them, in order to be really democratic, post-totalitarian constitutions, so constitution provided with eternity clauses, should open up radically to the claims of a sort of permanent constituent power. According to this counter-narrative, the constituent power becomes a vehicle of legal resentment, as Paul Blokker beautifully wrote. Finally, they tend to treat constitutions, and again, Italy is a fantastic example of this, in a self-serving approach. I mean, they tend to read the constitutions sometimes as a powerful and sovereign shield to use in order to question and attack the legitimacy of the European Union, which is frequently portrayed as the product of the coup d'etat, of a sort of coup d'etat. Here again, they present a false dichotomy, the Italian constitution versus the EU treaties, manipulating actually the message behind the Italian constitution, which is characterized by a strong a principle of international openness. So these were the points that I wanted to make. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Giuseppe, for shedding light on the features and pillar of the constitutional counter-narrative of populists. And let me thank also the other distinguished speakers in this first panel. We now move to another distinguished panel of speakers, this time discussants. And just let me tell you all that the floor will be open for Q&A after the discussants have spoken, so feel free to write your comments down in the chat. So the first discussant I introduce here is Paul Blokker, who is Associate Professor at the Sociology and Economic Law Department, University of Bologna, an expert of both populism, constitutional backsliding in Italy and in Eastern Europe. Let me just recall the book that he recently published with Manuel Anselmi on populism, Multiple Populism, Italy's Democracy Mirror, which is linked to our discussion today. So Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank the organizers very much for having me here in this particular role, which is not an easy role, because in one way I feel a bit in a conflict of interest, in the sense that there's a chapter of mine in one of the books which I'm supposedly going to critically discuss, and I will try to. But I'm also, on the other hand, in a difficult position, because I think these are both very important books. They're very necessary books. And one of the things that strikes me is that they both have a comparative program, which I think could be fleshed out even much more. And that might be two potential points for both books. I will try to be more or less structured, but it won't be easy, because I'm going to pick up also on a couple of things that have been said in the very interesting presentations. One aspect is, as Giuseppe touched upon also at the very end of his intervention, is the role of the European Union. And there, one of the aspects I particularly appreciate in the introduction to the book of Matej and Jernej is a rather critical position with regard to the European Union, and particularly in terms of the Central and Eastern European and the Southeastern European context. A claim they make, and I tend to back that claim up, is that there has been too little understanding of the social, political, economic realities of these countries. And so that is something I would like to right now already ask both Matej and Jernej to comment on further. How should we take this argument further? What does this also mean in terms of a research agenda? And then the point made on, and that's a second dimension I would like to refer to, the point made on overt and covert backsliding. I think on the one hand, this is an interesting distinction, but on the other, I wonder to what extent we cannot see both processes occurring in one and the same society. I mean, perhaps, and maybe that's the way I try to read the Polish reality, perhaps one could read the current much more overt project of the Law and Justice Party undermining liberal democracy and constitutional democracy as a latest addition to a more long-term covert project, or perhaps not even project, but simply situation. And that brings me to a point that I think all the speakers might want to reflect upon more, which I think is really essential. And now finally, some research around these issues is coming to the fore, and that is civil society, social forces, but also more in general sense, perhaps even in a kind of Mortatian sense, the material dimension to constitutions. And that indeed links, I think, the debates in both books in two important extents, but perhaps both books have not yet fleshed that dimension out sufficiently. That is, and that brings me indeed to the Italian case. How should we then, if we present the Italian case, and which, by the way, also in that book that was briefly mentioned, which I co-edited with Manuel Anselmi, is a claim we make, the Italian case as a case study, as a comparative case, not as an isolated case. So how are we going to think about that case, and how does it make us, help us exploring other cases as well? And I think one of the remarks that Giuseppe made at the end on anti or post-totalitarian constitutionalism might be an important link, and that equally links up again then with the notion of material constitution and with the notion of the social and political forces that actually back up a particular constitutional system. And so there, the Italian case, I think, is extremely important because, at least in my reading, the 1948 constitutional compromise that underpins, probably even today still, a lot of the existing constitutional democratic order, that particular compromise has become pretty dramatically challenged from the early 1990s onwards. So much so that some, like Valerio Nina, speak of a kind of season of constitutional reform, which is not merely about technical issues, mostly often claimed pertain to the second part of the Italian constitution, but it's clearly a rupture in Italian history in terms of how to relate to the 1948 constitution. And so that would be one dimension, I think, where the Italian case could be explored even further, and which could also be linked then, and this is more hypothetical in a way, and that is also a point of critique I would have on the book on Italian constitutionalism and populism, is that there's no concluding chapter, and and that might be actually pretty much needed. How do we perceive the future of Italian constitutional democracy in a broader light? And that is another dimension I think we should remind ourselves of continuously, in a broader light of in which populism and its approach towards the law, towards the rule of law, towards liberal constitutionalism is under attack, not mainly or only in Italy, or not merely in Hungary and Poland, but in many, many parts in Europe, but also outside of Europe. And that's something to think about as well. What does this mean for our model of post or anti-totalitarian constitutionalism? I think this is a further aspect to be explored in a comparative lens, exactly, and in a historical lens. And that also brings me back again to Matej and Jernej's book, where some of the arguments they make is that the insights into what has happened and what is happening in Central and Eastern, Southeastern Europe are insufficiently appreciated by the European Union, but also by generally by many, let's say, more Western scholars. And so aspects of transitional justice are underplayed, are not sufficiently appreciated. I would add to that also the whole moment of change from communism to post-communism, 1989 in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, 1991 for the former Yugoslavian states. That whole moment is of crucial importance because it is still a bone of contention. It's still part of a large debate of the finalité, of the end goals of that society that emerged from the early 1990s onwards. And probably it's not by coincidence, more or less the same years as in Italy, the major post-Second World War rupture emerged around Tangentopoli, etc., etc. And so I would also like to make it, I'm not sure how much time I still have left, but I would also like to strongly emphasize not only the comparative dimension, but the great need for an historical approach, particularly if you look at the Central Eastern and Southeastern European part. It seems to me that we need to very carefully reassess the past. I just had an article in the Journal of Modern European History, part of a special issue where exactly that it's that we try to do, to reassess what was socialist legality actually about? What actually did it mean? What role did dissidents play in promoting human rights, constitutionalism, but also what role did it play perhaps in reproducing certain images of constitutionalism that are still with us today? And so how do we understand continuities and discontinuities? And that's another matter, I think, that is extremely important to realize in Central and Eastern, Southeastern Europe, is there's this very strange coincidence, and perhaps not so strange in reality, of practices of populists nowadays. For instance, if you look at the way Orban and Kaczynski deal with civil society, it closely dovetails with processes that happened during communist times. So there is definitely a certain amount of continuity that we have perhaps appreciated in the past when EU enlargement, etc., has been praised as putting Central and Eastern, Southeastern Europe onto the path towards liberal constitutional democracy. And so then actually a final remark, because I'm close to, my time is almost up, and there we are. And so a final remark on this tension that Giuseppe mentioned between constitutionalism and populism, which is, I think, is very important. But I think we need to appreciate that populism plays into a myth of popular sovereignty. But I think it can equally be argued that constitutionalism, the way we understand it in the post-war, post-totalitarian model in that guise, there's equally an attachment to a kind of apolitical, neutral myth of order, of fabrication, I would like to call it, of a legalistic democracy, which, however, and that's one part of the populist story, I think, is now increasingly openly, in an overt sense, being heavily contested as problematic. And there are problematic dimensions to that model, in my view. And so I believe we need to critically discuss them rather than simply praise rule of law, liberal constitutionalism, etc. But I stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for these important comments and reflections. And I now pass the floor to Roberto Castaldi, who is Associate Professor of Political Philosophy. He cooperates with Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies and is the director of CesUE, this study center, providing also training, communication in matters of UN global governance, and one of the leading forces behind EURACTIV Italy, if I'm not wrong. So without further ado, I give you the floor, Roberto. Thanks.
Thank you, Cristina, and thanks to all the organizers. It's a great pleasure not just to participate in this webinar, but also for CesUE and for EURACTIV Italy to contribute to this event within our We European project, Jernej project. It's a project by which we are trying to highlight the importance of the European Union for citizens all over Italy and of course for in the other European countries. And I think the discussion we are having today is very much linked to this. So I would like to make just a few comments on the two books from a political theory perspective. And the first issue is about the overall project of undermining constitutionalism, which is the project of illiberal democracy. And illiberal democracy is not a democracy at all, but the fact that those who aim at a new form of authoritarian rule still need to represent their view as a democratic view suggests that democracy still has a very strong legitimizing power for public opinion, which means that even those who want really to undermine democracy as we know it, as liberal democracy, still have to use those words. And this is why it's so crucial what Giuseppe was talking about, the disguise of populism trying to exploit some elements of constitutionalism. And regarding this aspect, I would like to point out one of the crucial issues which has emerged in all these attempts, which is the undermining of the independence of the judiciary, which is apparently a legal issue, a constitutional issue, and a technical one. But eventually we have found out, especially when we look at the situation in Hungary and Poland, but not just in these countries, as the other book by Matej and Jernej shows, is that there are a number of other issues at stake, which are political, institutional, and cultural. Political, the interlinkage, the interaction between national and European politics is crucial. The fact that the Fidesz party was a member of the European People's Party has been a crucial element in the delay by the European Union in tackling what was happening in Hungary, and in somehow not realizing the relevance, the importance, and what was at stake there from the beginning. The second element is institutional, and as Matej pointed out, the fact that unanimity rule dominates the decision-making procedure at the European level regarding the defense of the rule of law means that it makes it extremely difficult to be used, especially if there are more than a country in which we have these tendencies, because one can put a veto in favor of the others, providing a fantastic coverage for what is happening in both countries. And the third aspect that was also pointed out very effectively in Matej and Jernej book is about the problem of the legitimacy of the European Union in intervening to protect the rule of law in single member states. And this is due to the fact that the European Union is an autonomous legal order, as the European Court of Justice has pointed out, but is still not based on a clear constitutional pact. If you want, it's not a federation. Maybe it's not yet a federation. We don't know where the process will end. But this is an issue that makes it more difficult in political terms for the EU to intervene. And therefore, the only action that have been taken were taken by the European Court of Justice, which is a federal institution. Just like on the economic side, we usually see that it's the European Central Bank, which is also a federal institution, the one which is the quickest and the most effective in answering big crises, like in 2011 with the sovereign debt crisis, or with the pandemic now, where the ECB was the first to act with a massive action of over €1 trillion to make it possible for different member states to make new debt to deal with the pandemic. So this is the first point related to the issue of illiberal democracy and the role of the EU in handling this kind of project. The second issue is about Italy and populism, and so move to the book by Giacomo, Giuseppe, so on. This is a crucial issue. I think that you are right, as you point out in the book, that Italy is a very important case study for populism, and but Italians usually don't think so. When we speak about the undermining of rule of law, people think about Hungary and Poland and don't think that things can happen in Italy or are happening in Italy. And the fact that, for instance, Matteo Salvini has explicitly said that he thinks that Hungary and Poland are the best ruled countries in the whole EU, or that he feels more confident and more at home in Putin's Russia than in any European countries, should be a very worrisome element regarding the risks that Italy is facing with regards to constitutional backsliding and the erosion of the rule of law. And from this point of view, I'd like to make a criticism of the title of Giacomo Delledonne chapter about the yellow-green government, because the green in English and in Europe are the green, while the League is clearly black. The League at the European level is allied with Le Pen and with all the most extreme far-right group. And this is clearly identified in the European level as the extreme right. So it's the black, not the green. It's true that in Italy we used to associate the color green to the Northern League, but this league is very different from that one on the one hand, and at the European level and in English the green is usually associated with the environmentalist organization. But this is also an element which is relevant for the Italian debate, because until we don't realize where is the League position today, which means with the black, with the extreme right, with Jobbik, with Le Pen and so on, Golden Dawn and so on, it is more difficult for Italians to understand the real potential impact of this party on Italian politics, rule of law and political system. And of course, this element is made more risky in Italy because it's a country that has a very weak public ethic, has basically no memory, and the public debate and the political competition is based on the lack of memory. So it is possible for people that have been in government for 20 years to campaign promising the moon, like if they were not in office until the day before, and so on and so forth. And clearly, this is a context in which makes the populist narrative and the populist claims a more effective vehicle, because there is not a rational public debate asking, putting to the test the promises with what people have really done when they were in power. And this has been emphasized very well in several of the chapters of the book. And the third issue I would like to raise is about Europe, in the sense that Europe is becoming the new dominant political cleavage in most national competition too, but is also becoming a dividing line among populists themselves. And we have different kind of populism at European level. If we think about Spain, for example, we have Podemos and Ciudadanos that have been considered example of a new populist movement, and they are both strongly pro-European. While in Italy, we had two different populism, the League and the Five Star Movement, and they were both anti-European, with the Five Star Movement on a more ambiguous note, which was essential for them to be able to make an alliance either with the League or with the Democratic Party after the election. So they made a nationalist turn to go with the League in the first part of the legislature. And when their government collapsed, they made a pro-European turn to make the alliance with the Democratic Party. But essentially now this is the main line of division between the Five Star Movement and the League. So the two populist parties in Italy are divided mainly by their position on Europe. And I think this is an essential element because I believe that the future of democracy is strictly linked to the future of the European Union. Liberal democracy cannot survive at national level alone, because sovereignty in the 21st century can only be effectively exercised at European level. We are facing such huge challenges that they cannot be handled at national level. They can only be handled at European, and some of them only at the global level, in fact, when we speak about climate change and this kind of global problems. So when we have this narrative of nationalism, of popular sovereignty applied at national level, which basically reflect a 19th century vision of sovereignty in a 21st century world in which this sovereignty cannot be effective. At the same time, we are seeing a new narrative about European sovereignty coming out, and the first to do that was Macron in France, and he was astonished to have a French president using the word sovereignty applied to the EU and not to France itself. And so we are seeing a new framing of the narrative related to sovereignty. So one based on national sovereignty, on 19th century, if you want, national sovereignty, and on the other one, the attempt to create a new narrative of a European sovereignty more linked to the 21st century realities. And I think my closing remark would be about what we are living today. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that no member state can do it alone. No member state has the power and the resources to deal with such a huge problem and its economic impact alone. And we are seeing that there is a request by European citizens, civil society, academics, and so on, economic actors for a European answer, which has provoked a proposal by the Commission, the Next Generation Europe Plan, which is nobody would have thought 6 months ago that something like that could have even been discussed at European level. So I think that what we are seeing is a great reshuffling that can also impact significantly on the new narrative of sovereignty, which will impact also on the populist discourse. And if we'll arrive to a reform of the European Union, this will also provide the new legitimacy to intervene more strongly in defense of rule of law and at the national level as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Roberto, also for these important remarks from the European perspective and on current developments. And now we give the floor, I can give the floor to Armen Mazmanyan, who is a senior research fellow at the American University of Armenia. He's an expert, amongst other things, of post-Soviet politics and constitutional law. He has collaborated with a variety of European universities. He's the director of the Pella Institute for Policy Dialogue and its Center for Constitutional Studies in Yerevan. So, Armen, you have the floor. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Cristina. Thank you, colleagues, for very insightful presentations and reports. I'm very happy to be part of this brilliant panel, and congratulations also to the authors and the co-authors of the two books, which definitely enrich our knowledge about the two countries, but also the global developments with populism, democracy, constitutional democracy being, of course, probably the main concern of all of us. Now I want to reflect on these two books, or the debate of today, actually trying to not simply concentrate on the case studies of these books, which I said were brilliant indeed, but trying to bring this debate more to the global level and the comparative level. And also, since I'm the last to present in this panel, probably to also stimulate a debate on what comes next and where is the world, where is the global community going with this experience having already spread all over the world. And in this exercise, I will really want to rely on and bring Umberto Eco, maybe surprisingly, but to support and illustrate some of the points I want to emphasize here. And I want to rely on his very famous essay on fascism, the eternal fascism, Urfascism, which I'm sure you all know, but revisiting it would probably spread additional light on the things we are discussing. Of course, doing that, I do not want to draw any parallels between Italy in the times of Mussolini and Italy now. It's exactly not my intention, but I first, again, want to make the perspectives of today's discussion more global, more comparative in a sense, but as also Paul suggested, more historical in their essence. And I also want to, having this experience, maybe a bit extreme experience, a bit exaggerated experience of fascism, to understand where does this populist tendency goes. Maybe my position would be a bit pessimistic, but I mean, having that extreme perspective may help arrive at the end of the panel to the more balanced approach. Now, I want to concentrate on several of Eco's features by which he distinguishes fascism, and I want to suggest that they are exactly coincided with how we could describe today's populist regimes. Let us look at a few of them, for example. He says that one of a very typical feature of fascism was irrationalism. And if we look at some of the most populist regimes of today in the world, and if we just ironically look at, for example, some of the responses to COVID, for example, we could really see how irrational are these populist regimes. Most anecdotically, maybe, the leader of Belarus, which we know as the consolidated authoritarian country, but maybe only those who are following this country very closely know that it's also a very typical populist country, populist leadership at least. So suggesting to fight COVID by shots of vodka. Anecdotal and yet very representative of populism. On a more serious level, let's look at how world leaders, more global leaders, are responding to climate change, how Trump or Bolsonaro respond to climate change, representing denial, anti-intellectualism, anything that is connected with critical attitude. Denialism of everything is a very representative of both, as Eco would say, to fascism, but also to populism. Fear of difference, obviously, very much reflected in how these populist regimes that we all know today are responding to migration crisis, Orban, for example, or the Italian populists. The appeal to frustrated middle class, machismo. I don't want to go into details of this for the lack of time, but it's very representative again. Obsession with the plot, and especially with a hypothetical international plot. Orban. I used to live in Hungary last year, being part of the Central European University program there. And I was amazed to see, even at the level of public advertisement, this visual advertisement depicting Soros, then the head of the EU presidency, Juncker, in a way to kind of represent an international plot against Hungary. Soros on one hand and the EU plotting conspiracy against Hungary. This is very representative. But what about Trump? Trump speaking of a plot of China with the World Health Organization. Ridiculous, isn't it? Of these features of fascism that Eco depicts and which clearly go into the characteristics of populist regimes, for me at least, I'm very much admiring and trying to concentrate especially the one in which Eco says that fascism is really distinguished, or was really distinguished, with the lack of ideology. We are seeing a lack of ideology throughout the world in all the regimes which we try, or we do identify with populism. And indeed, if we even try to at least associate any of the famous populist regimes with any ideology, it's rather anti-ideology. I mean, I'm failing to identify Trump with republicanism. And definitely I'm not identifying Putin, for example, with any ideology. It is exactly anti-ideology. Putin is anti-liberal. He is neither liberal nor anything. He is not conservative, he is not Republican. He is anti-liberal, and this is how the entire state ideology in brackets here, is built. And that's why I would in any other context argue that Russia probably at the moment doesn't have an ambition to be a superpower, or at least a first-class superpower, because it doesn't have a first-class ideology. However, our attitude is towards communism. Communism was, in a way, a very attractive normative concept, and it made Russia or the Soviet Union a first-class superpower. But this lack of modern identity in Russia currently, it makes it obviously not a first-class superpower, but a superpower in a way responding to a first-class superpower. I probably distracted you from the main discussion, but I think these are important considerations, and I'm coming to the core of my response, in which I also want to identify some more direct responses to the chapters which we are discussing today. This component of lack of ideology in modern populist regimes makes us think about exactly what kind of populisms are we talking about. And let me remind you that even the title of this panel speaks about populisms, not populism. And I suggest that the authors and also the speakers and everyone, actually, we should distinguish between the types of populism based on what I suggested here, and at least distinguish between post-authoritarian populism. I agree that probably this is in the minority of cases today, but yet looking at Ukraine, for example, very much populist regime, but populist that is a response to authoritarian or more corrupt practice. The same is true about Moldova, Armenia. I would think maybe there are some elements of this about also in Italy, which and Brazil, which also emerge from not maybe authoritarian, but very much corrupt practice of the past. So post-authoritarian populism versus neo-authoritarian populism. So here, I think the distinction is important to make. And at the same time, and these are probably equal, considerations to distinguish between utopian or naive populism and abusive authoritarian populism. And of course, looking at the main paradigmatic cases of authoritarian populism today, we have to understand them more in also in light of this distinction, and understand what kind of instrument they are using or abusing, including and very much so, the constitutional instruments. And this was perfectly and very illustratively demonstrated in the chapter in the book on Italian populism, where the populists are abusing actually constitutional amendment, the referenda, the courts, the electoral systems in many cases, in Hungary, for example. So these are the constitutional institutions that are getting abused by authoritarian populists. And the idea here is to manipulate the public, while the naive or post-authoritarian populism is rather, it's due to its naivete, romanticism in a way, emerging from their experiences of the past. They are appealing to the public rather than manipulating to the public. Maybe the line between the two is not so clear in every situation, and maybe in some situations one can flow. For example, naive romantic populism may also flow to authoritarian populism, but in some cases it may vanish. And now the second perspective, which I, concluding this response, want to present, is just for every one of us to also think, where does the world go, or where the populist regimes of today are going, also having in mind also these distinctions. And as far as these naive utopian populist regimes are concerned, I believe, especially in light of the COVID, in light of lack of professionalism in which these governments could respond to COVID, some of them may vanish or disintegrate, or at least change their largely populist nature. But what about those abusive populists? And again, here comes my, at least, imitation of pessimism. Is it that the regimes which are going in the direction in which Umberto Eco would warn us when we said we must keep alert so that the sense of these words will not be forgotten again? Ur-fascism is still around us. Ur-fascism can come back under the most innocent of these guys. So is this about the modern populist regimes that we're facing today, about Hungary, Poland, about Trump and Putin? I think this current situation, and the world is living right now very, very turbulent times, which will also be a test for these regimes too. One of the most illustrative or more immediate tests is coming in the coming days in Poland, as they will be having a presidential elections in a week or two. Maybe this is the lesser or the more local example, but we will also see in the fall with the elections in the US, whether Trump is again able to mobilize on the differences, for example, on possibly, but hopefully not, on racist divisions, or the anti-racist mobilization is gonna kill him on the contrary. And finally, again, I'm joining the voices of the colleagues who presented before me and seeing where the dust with the COVID comes down, what will be the legitimacy of the EU institutions and the EU leaders in responding to the crisis, and whether the EU emerges as a strong or stronger institution, or it is delegitimized in a way. And this will play a very, very important role, not only for Europe, but also for global politics and the world in general. This much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armen, for these reflections also about prospective developments in the time of pandemic and post-pandemic, and also on drawing our attention on the variety of populism we should be aware of. So thanks again also to the discussants for their very insightful comments. And now I want to see, so we can open the floor for the Q&A, and I will try to collect and summarize a few questions that I see written down amongst the live comments. There is already one by Nedim Ogic to Matej, but also to Jernej, on the relationship between this constitutional decay and its impact on political competition in Slovenia. Matej, if you want.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Nedim. It's I could go for a long time discussing this, but as we stress in the book, it's not so much the political spectrum as such. The political space in Slovenia it is the political space in Slovenia that is affecting the constitutional democracy, and not the constitutional elements of the Slovenian constitutional democracy that might be hampering the political competition inside the political space. The problem is that we have witnessed, especially over the last decade, a complete implosion of the political space, meaning that the traditional political parties, even those that were able to be established in the 20 years of Slovenian independence, have basically disappeared, and that since 2008 we have seen constant rounds of the so-called political lists that do not want to describe themselves as political parties, but they call themselves apolitical lists that have prevailed in the political battle, in the elections, taken over the government, but then immediately collapsed after a few years, since they didn't have the kind of infrastructure that you need as a political party. And these political lists were then essentially dependent on the formal and informal structures of the Slovenian state, influential factional groups, and where those influential factional groups were governing through these apolitical lists the political situation in Slovenia. So this would be my quick response to your question, but I dedicate a whole chapter to the so-called vicious circle of democracy in Slovenia, and I invite you to have a look at it if you're interested.
Thanks, Matej. And let's see if Jernej has something to add, some other remarks.
Sure, I can add a brief response. I agree with Matej. I think that the main challenge, to constitutional democracy in Slovenia is not the formal structure, but is the political environment, as the institution of political space are very weak. They can change, from one election to another. We had 3 or 4 examples of political parties being established just a month or month and a half before parliamentary elections, and then that those political parties won elections, or they came second on third, meaning that political parties, as also institutions of constitutional democracy, are understood as a means, to collect the prey of Slovenian state, both in financial, human resources, but also more pragmatic way. So the gist is that the environment is extremely weak and is subject to attempts of a state capture, of dirty togetherness and corruption.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to you as well. And I think now I don't see other questions for the moment. Maybe more will be added later. So I would like to give the chance to the speakers to respond to the comments of the discussants, and I will follow the reverse order probably in which they spoke. So starting with Giuseppe Martinico, maybe for 5 minutes each would be okay.
Okay, well, thanks indeed, first of all, for all these comments and questions. I think that there is a lot of stuff, I mean, for the discussion. I want to start by gathering a couple of points that both Paul and Armen made. So about the importance of the comparative analysis, carried out that, I mean, both at historical and synchronic, I would say, level. And indeed, I mean, the Italian case is very interesting from this point of view. I do agree with Paul when he emphasizes that, I mean, the importance of populism as a window of opportunity to rethink upon some long-standing issues that have been in the life of our constitutional polity. So I think that you're right, and indeed, what I think is that populism, especially this new wave of populism in Italy, obliges, we'll say, I mean, constitutional lawyers and constitutional history, constitutional lawyers and constitutional theorists, sorry, to deal with some long-standing subject, I would say, of constitutional law. I tried to make a list that, I mean, the first point is a new reflection over the myth of the Italian resistance as a unitary moment. So this has a lot to do with the idea of the constituent power as something unitary, which shapes the fundamental compromise of the constitutional legal system. There are important books, I mean, written by historians, I mean, Pavone and many others, who have questioned actually this view. I mean, showing that the Italian resistance was a sort of civil war. And this leads me to the second important point, the issue concerning the neutrality of constitutions, the issue of the neutrality of post-totalitarian constitutions or post-World War II constitutions. This is a burning issue. And this is a point which has been employed by many populist leaders. I mean, not only Salvini, but even Berlusconi and many others. In this sense, as Marco Tarchi pointed out, that I mean, Italy has been the lab, I mean, a sort of promised land, I mean, for those who are interested in populisms. So this is also true. And the fact is that probably Italy, and this confirms the importance of historical comparative research, Italy didn't deal with its own past. And there are here the beautiful books by Battini, for instance, right? So, and this has created a kind of political and cultural environment which has favored the emergence of this new wave of right-wing populism. So I think that you are right, and that when I quote here a line I mean, written by Spadaro many years ago, he said the constitutions belong to all, but they are not empty, they are not politically neutral. I think that this point is powerful. They tend to include, constitutionalism is different from populism as it tends to include the other. And the other is a competitor, it is not an enemy. But at the same time, and this is my final point, the other topic that we are gonna for sure study in the future is the relationship between direct and representative democracy. And I think that we can find something useful even in the proposals advanced by some of these populist movements. Final thing, the lack of a concluding chapter. That actually we try to understand this book as a research agenda. That's why on purpose we didn't write a final chapter, but I do agree. I mean, perhaps it is a pity. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Giuseppe. And in the meantime, there is a new question. Maybe the other speakers can take it into account, by Adriano Martufi, who is asking about the use of the notion of constitutional democracy and liberal democracy as synonyms. So what is your take on that, as both books emphasize a lot the notion of constitutional democracy? There is a contrast with liberal democracy or social Rechtsstaat. So for the other speakers, and the next one on the list is Jernej.
Thank you very much for the comments and questions. They really made me think. The last question, which was or the challenge posed by Armen, what does it mean for the future development in a comparative context of liberal and constitutional democracy? I think this is a super topical question, no? And also, if I connect this question to the point made by Paul, remarking that perhaps the European Commission, European Union do not properly understand the context, the socio-economic, political context of many of the states of Central and Eastern Europe. I would agree with this point. We addressed this point briefly in our book, arguing that there is an overemphasis on the context of Poland and Hungary, and that the Commission turns a blind eye to Central Eastern European states, even though, as you know, it has supervisory mechanisms over some judicial proceedings, both in Romania and Bulgaria. But I would say, given my recent research, and I'm following the developments in Southeastern Europe, I would say that the European Commission, but also the member states, do not take seriously the decay of constitutional democracy and rule of law, particularly within the Southern Eastern Europe. If you talk about this Balkan region, the populist movements in Serbia, Macedonia, in some parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the long-term process of joining the European Union, and also the postponement on the negotiations with Albania and some other states. I would say that the European Commission does not really take it seriously. What kind of effects such decisions, such messages convey to the governments, but also to the institutions in those countries? The effects could be very, very negative. They could in turn, move those countries more to even further to totalitarian examples, which we see outside, the European continent. So I agree with Armen, but also Paul, that the world is in a difficult times, and the question of constitutional democracy as being the model for development of many parts of the world is being questioned by systematic and general arbitrary practices across the world. And if I just briefly try to reply to the last question, well, constitutional democracy has been the model, for developing the states coming from authoritarian regimes to democracy, and I still think there is a point in that, in persisting with this project. But nonetheless, as we also mentioned in the book, the constitutional democracy depends on all of us. It depends on people. Depends how people will keep and protect their own integrity, honesty and fairness. And that is often difficult to achieve in environments which, culture-wise, are not very prone to these practices. So we'll see in the next decades whether the concept will be strengthened or weakened. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now it's time for Giacomo to respond, to react to the comments.
Thank you, Cristina. So, couple of remarks. Paul Blokker has highlighted, on the one hand, the need for comparative analysis that also considers the diachronic, the historical dimension, and he has argued that a research agenda should leave some room for analyzing the role of social forces for a material understanding of the Constitution in Mortate's sense. This is a very important point in my view, and it's a very important point here. I'm not speaking about the topic of our book. I'm rather speaking of liberal democracies in Central and Eastern Europe. If you think of the joint operation of, on the one hand, the weakness of civil society, the lack of acceptance, the apparent failure of constitutional transitions after the downfall of communism. In this respect, the most telling case is Hungary. So you have to focus on how a transition to constitutional democracy after communism that was celebrated as a success turned into a perceived failure, and you understand the weakness of a social, the civil society, the social dimension, having in mind that it mirrors in some respects the lack of acceptance of the result of the constitutional transition after 1990. So this is just an example, but it's an example that I'm using in order to say that I agree with Paul's point that you have to focus jointly on the historical dimension and the civil society dimension. Then a quick rejoinder to Roberto. In fact, the yellow-green terminology has also been used by other scholars. For instance, there's a special issue of a journal, Contemporary Italian Politics, edited by James Newell, the yellow-green government 1 year on. Of course, these labels, green, black, yellow, have some subjective dimension in them. So yellow is the color of classical liberalism, of German classical liberalism, so something with which the Five-Star Movement is perhaps not so much related. Black may be the color of classic Christian democracy in Germany and Austria. And as regards the old league, the new league, there was an important book by two political scientists, Passarelli and Tuorto, who highlight that the northern card, the arguments based on northern autonomy, northern secession, may be a reserve card for the league if the sovereigntist, pro-Russian shift ultimately fails. So I think there is also some ambiguity in this. Finally, there is a question from Adriano Martufi. Personally, I would stay with the label constitutional democracy, because I think of it, at least from a continental viewpoint, as able to grasp the social dimension, as you put it, the sozialer und demokratischer Rechtsstaat, so the social dimension and also the pluralist dimension, so the idea that the constitutional order protects a number of possibly conflicting constitutional goods. And I think that the idea of constitutional democracy is more promising, more useful than the one of liberal democracy in this respect. And I also think that it is more useful if you focus on the relationship between government and society. Again, the issue of social forces, civil society returns. So if you think of it as one of mutual engagement, so to speak, I think that the notion of constitutional democracy is more promising. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Giacomo. And now it's the turn of Matej to respond to the comments. He has already intervened shortly, but this is the occasion for more extensive remark in 5 minutes.
Thank you. I wish I'd have 50 minutes instead of just 5, because the comments were indeed great. Paul speaking about the necessary refocusing or even focusing more in some other parts of the research agenda. Roberto specifying the importance of the European dimension, and Armen drawing our attention to the global dimension. I think I will start with Armen, and I will be somehow bound to share his pessimism, which might be unfortunately also substantiated by the actual facts in the contemporary global affairs. I think that indeed we are witnessing something big. We are living in special times where we are transiting from modernity into post-modernity, and this is bringing, and this paradigm shift which is occurring is indeed pulling from our societies, bringing from our societies out the most negative sentiments and practices that we can afford. So I agree. I mean, we live in the world of irrationalism, the world in which we fear difference. We live in the world where the middle class is frustrated, and good politicians know how to appeal to that. If it's an irrational world, of course, there are also plots. And indeed, there is a lack of ideology. But if there is a lack of ideology, that means that essentially anything goes. And what really matters, as Humpty Dumpty would put it, who is the most powerful or who is actually in the power. And now I think if the situation is like that, this poses a question for us. This raises a question for us as what are we expected to do as academics? And I think this really is an important question, because what I have, and it's of course my own observation, and I might be guilty of exaggeration and partiality, it's my subjective perspective, but I do not have any other one than my own subjective one. I think that in this, as the world has gone irrational, crazy, etc., over the last 10 or more years, I think also the academics have descended into the political fields. Many academics themselves have become politicians and have to a certain extent abandoned the traditional role of the academic, which is the role of a critical observer, of somebody who would like to understand with scientific tools that we possess, or at least proto-scientific tools that we possess, who would like to understand what is actually going on, to describe as accurately as possible what's going on, and to explain first to myself as an academic, and then to a broader community of peers of what is actually taking place in the society nowadays. I think that by the fact that academics have descended, deliberately or not, consciously or subconsciously into a political field, into these political fights. They have basically been put themselves up to grabs to the political glass, and they have been involved into a war that they cannot win, because the politicians, properly so-called, and populists will always prevail. So I think that's one important point that I'd like to finish it. If I still have 1 minute, I'd also like to applaud to what Paul has said. I think it's of utmost importance in the European Union, and when we speak about the European integration, that we do not focus just on the legal dimension. In the book that we as lawyers, me and Jernej, we are lawyers, and the book that we wrote, of course, is a book that lawyers can write, but I think that we tried as much to invest also in the sociological dimension. Because I think it is there in the sociological dimension how things are actually done, how a given constitution actually performs according to its standards, or it doesn't. So this material constitution, the economic relationships, the question where power actually lies, who wields this power and how, I think this needs to be brought into the forefront of our academic attention. And finally, of course, history matters a lot, because we have come where we presently are due to certain historical path dependence. Something has happened in this historical trajectory that has brought us to this point. So I think it is really necessary to reassess this history, to have another critical glimpse at it, to understand it better, because only on the basis of this better understanding, we will be able to come up with better normative prescriptions and to secure and to defend the viability of the constitutional democracy, which I think is the model that ought to be preserved even in these postmodern times where all certainty seems to be dissipating.
Thanks very much, Matej. I don't see any other questions from the audience, so maybe I just want to give the opportunity to our discussants for quick reaction, if they want, to what has been said, if they are willing to do so. Let's see. You are not obliged to, but
yeah, no, I'm happy to. I'm a bit embarrassed because of the richness of the discussion. I mean, I found some of the remarks really, really important, like Giuseppe mentioning the whole issue of what the Germans so wonderfully call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which, according to Giuseppe, is missing in the Italian case, and I think he's right. There are too many myths around still about the end of the war, but also of fascism itself as a regime. So that, I think, is a very important point. Also, what Matej just mentioned, and of course I couldn't agree more. Just one point of dissonance. Armen said that there's a lack of ideology, and there I'm not entirely sure. I mean, in my recent work, I've really tried to be comparative as much as I'm able to. And I believe if you look throughout the European context, and you link Orban with Kaczynski, with Salvini, with Le Pen, with the new rising populist Thierry Baudet in the Netherlands, for instance, there are common threats that have a certain ideological dimension to them, I think. And I tend to refer to them as conservatism, a particular kind of conservatism that has a particular view of the community, and liberal human rights in particular are often portrayed by these people as threatening that community. And that is, I think, one of the core points these populists try to make, which is not completely irrational, but it needs to put in the right perspective. And that's what populists often don't do. They blow up a certain critique on human rights out of proportion. And so, well, that's just a dissonant point. For the rest, I found really the remarks in this second round really of enormously high quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe let's see if Roberto has some remarks.
No, I would like especially to thank Matej because for what he said about the need to complement the legal perspective with the sociological one, in the sense that as a political philosopher, I tend to agree with what Bobbio said about rights. That rights are always the results of a fight, of a political fight for the recognition of those rights. And now one of the problem we have is that the new rights are rights that cannot be guaranteed only at the national level. At the same time, we don't have a polity at the European and at the global level where we can have normal polities to get certain rights recognized. And this is true for the right of movement of people. Today we have the right of movement for money. Capitals can move around the world, but people cannot. And for the recognition of the traditional human rights all over the world, and also of trying to get them recognized by fleeing where they are not, which is a right that is increasingly challenged even in Western world and in Europe. So that issue, I think, is crucial for all scholars. And I also agree very much with Matej's point about the responsibility as academic to try to contribute to the debate and to the public debate on all these issues, because our society is running a deep risk. Eventually, this is also the reason why with CesUE we launched EURACTIV Italy. It was over 2 years that EURACTIV was absent from Italy, which with all its shortcomings and problems is still the third largest country in the EU. And we believe that it was a challenge worth taking to contribute to the information and the public debate on European issues in our country.
Thanks very much. And last but not least, Armen. Some final remarks.
Yes, Cristina, thank you very much. And since time is quite limited, we have only a few minutes left. I would simply want to respond to Paul's very good question, by the way. And I think this is a question that needs further research and has to be really addressed more in the literature. But my first reaction would be, of course, everything can be labeled as ideology. Anti-ideology is in a way ideology. Of course, most of the regimes which we are dealing with are conservative, but this is why I said I refuse to really label Trump's ideology as conservatism or as republicanism, because it is not in its classical meaning. What I'm saying, they are not ideological, these systems. They do not fit into any classical definition of ideologies. Take Orban. Actually, he has a famous article in which he says, I am a Democrat. I'm simply not a liberal Democrat. I'm an illiberal Democrat. Putin has an ideology in that sense too. It's called sovereign democracy. Once he had this ideology entirely presented as the ideology of his regime, of his government, etc. As Roberto put very perfectly, and I agree to that, I subscribe to that, illiberal democracy is not democracy. And I believe so. And I also believe so that sovereign democracy of Putin is not democracy. And this is how the majority of experts in the field also think. And by the way, if you also take the perspective of emerging democracies, smaller democracies or struggling democracies, I could even say that some of them are even more liberal in their nature. My native Armenia is in that state. So populism that is currently, this is how I label my government currently, it is response to anti-democratic and corrupt practices of the past. So in a way, the entire ambition of this government is to build democracy, but populism is the way that currently, and this is due to also the nature of the protest movement, that they believe democracy should be. But again, ideologically, they are rather on the side of democracy, but I refuse to understand this as democracy in its pure, real terms. That much. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Armen. And thank you all. We are reaching the conclusion of this webinar. So thank you all to all the speakers, the discussants, for their important reflections, also the audience. It seems that this Italian-Slovenian collaboration is very fruitful, actually European collaboration at large. And I hope that new initiatives can be organized soon. So do join me for a virtual applause of our speakers, and be ready for new events to be circulated and promoted soon. Next week, STALS and Diritti Comparati respectively are organizing other webinars on the future of European integration in Italian on the 15th and on the 18th. So more information will be circulated soon. Thanks again for your attention.